Hello and welcome to Top Story. 5 years after the United States led the invasion of Iraq, what's remembered of the opposition of Europe's staunchest critic of the war? French President Jacques Chirac let no one be in any doubt. France could see no reason in March 2003 for going to war with Iraq. The UN weapons inspection regime was working, and the threat posed by Saddam Hussein had been significantly degraded. If the United States were to seek a new UN Security Council resolution authorizing the invasion of Iraq, he said, France would oppose that resolution. France's active opposition to the war was to cause the sharpest deterioration in Franco-US relations in decades and to create a divide within the European Union between what US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld called New and Old Europe. What were the lasting consequences of French opposition? What implications have there been for French foreign policy? And to what extent has the new French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, healed the rift between the two old allies? Well, joining me now to discuss the impact of Iraq on French foreign policy is Walter Posch, Senior Research Fellow at the EU Institute for Security Studies here in Paris. Thanks very much for being on Top Story. Well, Jacques Chirac warned before the start of the invasion in March 2003 of what the consequences would be for Iraq and what the consequences will be for the rest of the world in terms of increased terrorism. In many respects, I suppose one has to say that he's been vindicated.
Yeah, he has certainly been vindicated. Whether the former French president is happy about this vindication is certainly another question.
But I mean, certainly in terms of the situation inside Iraq and the increase in terrorism around the world, I mean, that's what's happened, and he warned of it.
Yeah, I even would say that the situation in Iraq turned out to be worse than most of the skeptics have expected in many regards, especially with regard to the breakdown of the Iraqi state.
But Washington never really forgave him that opposition either, did it? It was for many in Washington. He was grandstanding. He was trying to use the.
That was a phase, certainly. There was a time of very bad polemics between the U.S. and France. But I think what kind of healed these wounds was the extremely constructive and energetic policy from at least 2003, which started in 2003 over the Iranian nuclear program. So there was, yes, this big rift over Iraq where especially some member states and the US couldn't agree on policy and politics. But after all, after some while, there was more cooperation on other fields of international concern, like over Iran.
I mean, what seemed to really irritate Washington was Jacques Chirac's statement before the war actually started, that if the US were to seek a new resolution in the UN Security Council giving the go-ahead for the war, France would definitely vote no. And if push came to shove, that France may well use its veto as well. I mean, that's what really seemed to grate on the Americans' nerves.
Yes, I think what we can see now is the big shift and the change in international politics. If we compare this breakdown of international relation of this Western system over Iraq, and if we compare policies today, which are about over Iran, which are about first and foremost engagement or offering engagement, which are about consensus in the international community, then we see how much the world has changed, and in a way, we don't see that fierce American unilateralism any longer.
Well, that's a point that Jacques Chirac was making at the time as well. He said he wanted a multipolar world and he wanted the UN to play a central position in that world. Do you think that perhaps, in part at least as a consequence of France's opposition in 2003, that agenda has been pushed forward a bit?
Well, the multipolar world has developed in itself or not. That depends on how you interpret the current state of affairs on the global scene. But what has been a fact is that American prestige and even American power to a certain extent has severely been damaged by the managing or not managing of the situation in Iraq.
One of the consequences, though, negative consequences for France of Jacques Chirac's opposition to the invasion of Iraq was the divisions it caused within Europe, and in particular the criticism he made at the time of the new members of the EU's support for the invasion. Has that divide within Europe had a chance to heal since then?
Yes, I think so. The breakdown of European common foreign policy positions over the Iraq War was a big shock and as big a lesson. So European foreign policy is now much more conducted in coordination. It's much more based on on trust, on understanding, than it has been before. Everybody's on the shock. People don't want to live through that again, to this breakdown of the EU, which rendered the EU actually almost non-existent for a while, for almost a year on the international scene.
It caused enormous resentment within the EU, particularly amongst the new members, that Jacques Chirac should have spoken to them in that way, should have, as it were, appeared to disregard their right to have a position on the issue.
Well, it was before the new member states joined the EU, I guess, and after that I think a lot of diplomacy has been conducted, and this situation has to a certain degree been rectified.
What about France's position in the Middle East? One might have anticipated that as a consequence of France's opposition to the war in Iraq, that its position might have been strengthened in the Middle East. Is there any sign, though, that that has happened?
I think there has been long-term policies implemented by France on Middle East policies, which have to a certain degree certainly improved its position.
What though about Nicolas Sarkozy? Because he's adopted a position very different from that of Jacques Chirac. To an extent, one could almost say that when he went to Washington and spoke to Congress at the end of last year, he was almost apologizing for the position that France had taken in March 2003.
Well, I think we're in a different world now. People don't appreciate how much the world has changed, the international scene has changed, and how much, even if there is no inner Iraqi solution, and even if the situation is dramatic with long-term consequences, as you mentioned, of Iraq, there are new priorities now, and these new priorities have to do with Iran, have to do with Lebanon, and these new priorities force new policies and new policy formulations.
So no permanent rift between the United States and France, though?
Pardon me?
No permanent rift between the United States and France?
I don't see them.
No. Okay, thanks very much. That's all we have time for today. Thanks to our guest, Walter Posch. Join us again tomorrow for another edition of Top Story. Goodbye for now.